Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is political analyst Michael Baharaeen. Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
As we sit here right now, we are less than a month away from Election Day. And as we get closer and closer, really what is coming down to are the 7 battleground states. And a new poll just came out from Emerson College Polling that shows just how tight this race is. So I'll read out what it said yesterday and then we'll talk about it. So Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, Trump is up 1. In Michigan and Wisconsin, Trump and Harris are tied. In Arizona, Trump is up 2. And in Nevada, Harris is up 1. So when you look at these numbers, what sticks out to you?
I mean, it's just as you said, this is about as close of a race as you could imagine. And honestly, it is about as close as we've ever had in recent memory. The polls in all of the battleground states nationally have been neck and neck for months. Even back when Joe Biden was in the race, it was pretty close. Harris came into the race, took a lead in the national polling, but for this whole time, it has been neck and neck. And really, nobody has a great sense of how this is going to go. I mean, it could be just a few thousand votes either way, which is what we saw in each of the last 2 presidential elections. They came down to about 77,000 votes in 2016 in the 3 blue wall states. And then in 2020, it was even fewer, something around 45,000 votes in Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. So, there could, given how close the polls look right now, we're probably looking at another photo finish kind of election this cycle.
And probably not getting the results election night. It probably won't be wrapped up in a bow anytime soon. So I am curious, though, because you wrote a piece saying these are the counties to watch on election night. Because it's such a razor-thin race, now where are you keeping your eye when it comes to these 7 battleground states?
Yeah, so there's a few counties that I would point to just for folks who are tuning in on election night who might want to get a sense of, all right, even though it might take a while to call each of these states, like where might we find some clues? So the first one I would point to is in Michigan, which is Kent County. Kent is in the Grand Rapids area. This is an area that broke for George W. Bush by double digits only a couple decades ago, and then it swung to Obama pretty heavily in 2008 and 2012. And then in the last couple of elections, it has been very narrow margins. Joe Biden took it by a little bit in 2020. And it's the kind of fast growing kind of suburban type of area that we've seen in recent years, sort of trending away from Donald Trump. Now, the question is, if Harris is only matching Joe Biden's numbers there, is that going to be enough? If Trump continues to make inroads in some of the deeper red parts of a state like Michigan, is only matching Joe Biden in the suburbs going to be enough, or is she going to need to build on that? So Kent County is a great example of a place to look like that. Then I would look at Erie County in Pennsylvania. Erie has swung with the state pretty closely over the years. It was a state that went for Obama, broke for Trump in 2016, and then very narrowly swung back to Joe Biden in 2020. It's in the upper northwest part of Pennsylvania. Very working class, has a strong union history there. It's the exact kind of county where if Kamala Harris is regaining ground with the white working class, which is a big constituency, you might see her kind of matching Biden's margins there. If there's evidence that Trump is not only on track to flip Erie back, but even maybe do so by a wider margin than last time, that might start setting off some alarm bells at Harris headquarters. So those are just a couple of the ones that I would be paying attention to on election night.
You wrote in your piece that there may be early clues about how the swing states will vote. When will we see these clues specifically crop up? Is that before Election Day? Is it election night? What does that look like?
So a lot of it's probably going to come on election night. All these states have different rules around early voting, but we're not going to really have a clear sense of just how that's impacting things until election night at the earliest. And as folks will recall back to 2020, most of these states took several days to call. I don't think, have a final call until the following Saturday. So it depends on how fast they process things in some of these counties. Some of them will be able to do it very quickly. You'll be able, if you tune into CNN, MSNBC, any of these live shows, you'll be able to kind of see them filling in the maps. And if you take a look at my piece, it's up on the liberalpatriot.com. You can see which counties we've highlighted as ones to watch for. And then as they kind of start to get shaded in, you'll be able to see, okay, are these on track to match 2020 margins for Harris and Trump? Is Harris building on Biden's margins? Is Trump regaining some of his lost ground? So and it's in all 7 states as well. So even if some of the states are slower to count than others, you'll still maybe be able to start to get some of these clues earlier on election night.
I know that this is a tighter race than any time in history, or at least in modern history, according to these polls now. But are you looking at the 2022 midterms, or perhaps even going back to 2020 and getting any clues from those elections and looking at them for November 5th?
It's a good question. So there's a lot of, there are 2 very different elections. I mean, obviously, with presidential versus a midterm, but there are also, there's kind of a new reality right now. So in 2020, it's kind of hard to believe this was only 4 years ago, but there were several things that had not happened up to that point. January 6th, then Trump's efforts to overturn the election results hadn't happened. The Dobbs decision had not happened. Looking back at the 2022 midterms, you can see how the presence of abortion rights and in some of these exact swing states, perceived threats to abortion rights in those states, really rallied a lot of Democratic voters who kind of put up a bulwark against what was otherwise in the rest of the country a pretty good election for Republicans. And so the question in my mind right now is, considering what has happened since 2020, which of these factors is going to be a big deal? Yes, abortion is going to rally certain voters who care about that issue, most likely to vote for Kamala Harris. Trump also was not on the ballot in 2022, and as we sort of know, Trump tends to bring out certain voters who don't always get out to vote unless he is on the ballot. So there's a lot of factors that could kind of tip this election one way or the other. And it's partly what, as an analyst and somebody who observes elections, makes it kind of exciting to kind of see which of these factors will end up having the most sway on election night.
As we know, Donald Trump was on the ballot in 2016. He outperformed the polls then. In 2020, he also outperformed the polls. In 2022, he wasn't on the ballot, but the predicted red wave really failed to materialize. So how accurate, looking back at those past 3 elections, do you think the polls are showing this dead heat?
Yeah. So I would say I think there is reason to suspect, and it's hard to know for sure until we get the results on election night or election week, but I would suspect that the polls are probably a little bit more accurate this time around. So if we think back to 2016, the big thing that the pollsters missed was white non-college voters. They were not accounting for a growing education divide among white voters. And so they sort of didn't anticipate that there was going to be this groundswell of support for Donald Trump. A lot of these pollsters fixed that in 2020, but then something else happened in 2020 that everybody remembers, which was the COVID pandemic. And partly the theory for why the polls were off that time is that there were a lot of Biden supporting voters who were at home, were likelier to kind of stay at home during COVID, not risk going outdoors, and were a little bit more isolated, maybe a little bit more lonely, and therefore more willing to answer pollsters' phone calls. And so pollsters were getting a little bit of an inaccurate representation of just how strong Joe Biden's support was. I mean, there were polls back in 2020 that had Joe Biden up by 18 points in Wisconsin. He only won Wisconsin by less than a point. So to give you a sense of how that worked out in 2022, in a lot of these states, the polls were accurate. There were some sort of partisan polls that kind of muddied the picture a little bit, but in a lot of the key swing states, they were spot on. So, presuming that we don't have these sort of major factors that people couldn't anticipate the last time around, I think it's fair to suspect that the polls will be pretty accurate this time. I also think you can kind of see this in the demographic crosstabs, where you can see that Harris is still leading at the national level, but she's actually struggling with groups like Black voters and Hispanic voters, at least compared to Joe Biden in 2020, which tells me that they've got the right overall margins at the top because they're not overinflating her support among these key groups as well.
In 2020, Joe Biden took the blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Do you think it's possible that this year those three states won't go the same way? Is there a reality where one breaks off and goes Trump, two break off and go Trump, and one goes Harris? What do you think that looks like?
It's a good question. It's entirely possible. I mean, the last two elections, I mean, these three states have all been fairly close together, but the margins, the vote margins by which Trump won them in 2016 and then Biden won them in 2020, were a little bit different. I think in Michigan it was something like 1.2 points that Joe Biden won it by in 2020, and in Wisconsin it was closer to like half a point. So, when you're talking about margins this small, any small thing can tip one of these states one way or the other. I mean, you think about a state like Michigan, for example. I think nobody's really clear at this point just how big a deal the uncommitted block of voters in Michigan, specifically in Dearborn and Wayne County, is. How big is it, and how much of an impact could that make, depending on how close these margins are? But let's say it's a big enough contingent to make a difference. You could see potentially Michigan just barely flip to Trump, and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania stay in Harris's column in a really close race. It's somewhat likely, I would suspect, that all three will probably vote the same way. They have for many years. I think it's stemming back to 1992 or even 88. Where all three of these states have kind of voted in unison, including flipping to Trump in 2016 and then flipping back to Biden this time. But when you're talking about a razor-thin margin and a very close race, it's entirely possible that they may not all break the same way.
Obviously, we're going to be keeping our eye out on all 50 states, but on election night, especially these 7, when you're looking at them, is there a specific, and I know the math will shake out the way it does, but is there a specific state within these 7 that is a must win for each candidate?
Yeah, I would say the 2 that I'm looking at are Pennsylvania and Georgia. I think Pennsylvania, a lot of analysts consider Pennsylvania to be the tipping point state. It's just so big. The polls have it so close. It has been in Democrats' column for the most part outside of 2016 for several decades. Harris will have to win Pennsylvania. If she's not winning Pennsylvania, she still has a path. But because of how many electoral votes are at stake there, I think it makes it very, very difficult for her at that point. And the same thing for Trump in Georgia. Georgia was among the 3 states, the other 2 being Arizona and Wisconsin, last time around, that shifted the election over to Biden. And it also carries a large number of electoral votes. So if Trump is not winning there, I'm skeptical that it will be called on election night. But if it is called on election night and breaks for Harris, it's going to be there probably is going to be some panic setting in at Trump's headquarters.
Within the next 3 weeks, as we go to the home stretch between now and Election Day, what specifically are you looking out for? Is there any movement within the polls that you're looking for, any demographics that you're looking at specifically? Because we know that this is a tight race, but when you look at the numbers, I mean, the demographics within each state are really eye-opening.
Yeah, I would say I am curious about what appears to be a trend of what we would call racial depolarization. So you've seen in the past couple of cycles, Hispanic voters especially, but also Black voters, and even to some extent Asian, working class Asian American voters, starting to kind of shift toward Republicans. And at the same time, you've seen white voters actually starting to shift a little bit back toward the Democrats. Which Democrats have been losing white voters just in small bits for a long time. And based on the current polling that we have about the 2024 race, Harris is pretty substantially trailing Trump relative to Biden in 2020 among Black voters. I think she's down by about 15 points from where Biden was back then. Hispanic voters, there's still some evidence of that. Asian voters, the polls don't tend to capture the smaller subgroup. But if she is trailing with all of these kind of demographic groups going into election night, that could put a lot of stress on her campaign in places like, let's say, Nevada and Arizona with Hispanic voters, and places like Georgia with Black voters. Now, at the same time, white voters are a big slice of the electorate. They're an overwhelming majority, and she has made a lot of gains there, especially with college-educated white voters. So it's entirely possible that she can make up ground by making even more gains than what Biden had with them. And if she does that, and if she's carrying suburban counties like Kent County in Michigan, like Chester County in Pennsylvania, Cobb County, and Georgia, it's very possible that she can stand to lose a little bit of ground and she'll still be okay.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for between now and November 5th. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Brittany. Good to be here.